I want to go to something that was your direct action, which was removing Trump from Facebook. Does that feel like the right move?
One of my responsibilities in overseeing a whole bunch of teams in that company was, in this instance, did what Donald Trump said. I think he initially said it on Twitter and then just reposted it automatically on Facebook a couple of hours later. Did that break those community standards? That was the judgment I had to make.
Do you think it cost you your job?
What, that I suspended Trump?
Yeah.
That's a really weird question. Who else is going to know whether I got fired or not? Me.
Nick Clegg, I've just finished reading your book, How to Save the Internet, and I guess I'm trying to get a sense of where your head is now in terms of Facebook, in terms of Meta, because it is fundamentally an exploration of power, isn't it? The good and the bad. Is it?
The book?
Well, it's an exploration. I mean, you call it an exploration of power.
I see.
Social media giving lots of people a voice, giving voice to the voiceless, but also putting unimaginable wealth and political power in the hands of this tiny elite. Do you come away thinking Meta is a force for good?
I think the technology is a force for good. I think social media, I know this is an unfashionable point of view, but as I explain in the book, I think the evidence, at least to my mind, shows overwhelmingly that technology which allows people for free, because it's an ad paid service, so you don't have to pay a subscription, you don't have to pay a huge amount of money for a headset or anything. You can just, a poor farmer in Guatemala can use Instagram as much as a Wall Street banker can. I think it has had a democratizing effect in terms of expression, free expression, people sharing content around the world and so on. But I call it the power paradox. You're quite right. At the same time, it comes with this corollary, which is this extraordinary aggregation of power in the hands of a very small number of almost actually exclusively men on the west coast of America, and increasingly, slightly less well known, but I think will be increasingly influential in years to come, a small handful of Chinese big tech leaders too. And so I think that poses certainly as an ex-politician, a sort of fascinating dilemma, and particularly, dare I say, as a sort of liberal, which is, I love the empowerment bit. I'm really troubled by the amount of kind of concentration of power in the hands of a very small number of people, and that's where, of course, all of this evolution in big tech and the development of these so-called network effects as these things become so big so quickly collides with politics and collides with society, collides with issues around regulation and so on. And why I kind of think you can't really settle that power paradox without democratic governments setting sort of the swim lane in which these companies should operate. Because remember, they're run by engineers. They're not philosopher kings. They're not politicians. They don't spend their time worrying. Maybe we think they should, but they don't actually spend their time worrying too much about the societal trade-offs and the benefits and the cost benefit of having this technology exist in such a prevalent way across society. They're just constantly trying to come up with a new thing that they think people will use and will delight people and so on. So the balance, how you straighten out this sort of empowerment on the one hand and the kind of over-centralisation of power on the other, I think is an enduring dilemma.
Enduring dilemma doesn't take us that far, though. I mean, your book is called How to Save the Internet. Many people think the answer to that is less dominance by the oligarchs, and yet you don't seem to.
Well, I don't really know what that means. How do you wave a wand and say less dominance? You have these network effects which are just very well. It's a bit like saying I don't want gravity. I'm afraid when you connect people, there is a natural tendency, as I describe in the book, natural trend for these apps and services to grow in enormous scale, because the more people you're connected with, the more beneficial it is to you as a business, as an individual, as a creator, whatever. So sure, we can sit around in studios like this saying, I don't like network effects. I don't think that's going to get you anywhere. It's just sticking our head in the sand. So what I propose instead is something very concrete in the last sort of section of the book, which is a deal between the three main techno-democracies, India, Europe and the United States, to set new guardrails, to set new parameters, so that particularly this emergence of generative AI takes place, is bounded, if you like, by a shared understanding between democracies that loosely share similar values about privacy, about individual rights and so on and so forth, about how AI infrastructure is developed, how the corollary, that the harms that may flow from generative AI are monitored and mitigated, how data flows themselves are kept open. So that's what I propose. Of course, it seems highly unlikely that that is going to occur on a day when I think Modi is in Beijing,
Modi, of course.
because of the, dare I say it, the boneheaded stupidity of this US government has basically chased Modi, one of the most important figures in the modern world, into the arms of America's erstwhile rival in Beijing. I mean, as an act of geopolitical dumbheadedness, I think this spectacle of Trump mishandling his relationship with Modi just shows quite how out of depth this US administration. So it's just a short way of saying that it feels unlikely that that level of statecraft that is required and would require American leadership it's not exactly in evidence right now. I firmly believe it will happen, and it will happen not out of altruism, because I just don't believe the current course that America is on is going to win. They're just not going to win. You can't. The idea that you can clobber the rest of the world, humiliate the rest of the world, insult them, offend them, and just declare that somehow your technology or your trade needs should prevail over everybody else's. That is it's already eliciting a reaction. Look at Putin. Look at the leader of North Korea, a whole bunch of BRICS countries, and Modi and Xi Jinping in Beijing today. That is an illustration of the early failure of US statecraft. So at some point, and there's also a technological aspect to this, which is important, debatable but important, which is, I think there is a view amongst my former colleagues and certainly many other people in Silicon Valley that someone is going to deliver a knockout blow in this AI race, that someone suddenly, tra-la-la-la, someone out of the magic box will come this new AI model which will just vanquish all others. And I don't believe I think this technology is way more versatile than that. I think you're going to have a mixture of what's called closed and open source models. The Chinese are already leading on open source models, so they're going to get, because you can use them for free, you don't have to pay Sam Altman or Google for the use of these very powerful Chinese models. So you're already seeing a distribution and a deployment of Chinese AI leadership in Africa, Asia, and so on. Those trends are going to continue. I don't think there is going to be one hallelujah moment where everyone says, I've got super intelligence, I'm going to keep it under lock and key, and everyone can go hang. And because I don't think that's going to happen, and because of the geopolitical reasons I described earlier, at some point, the US administration is going to relearn something it's clearly forgotten currently, which is if it wants to project its own power, it has to do it in lockstep with others. And now that's unfashionable at the moment, and people can criticise the book and say you're kind of speculating on a future which doesn't seem very likely. I'm pretty confident the wheel will turn.
You've skipped ahead quite far to the future. I just want to take you back to Facebook, to Meta. Because reading the book, it seems like there is genuine ambiguity in your mind.
In my mind.
About the dangers of screen time, the dangers of Facebook, the dangers of Instagram for young people. You say how much we think we know about how corrosive screen time is to mental health. The data looks murkier and more ambiguous than headlines suggest. And yet, during your time at Facebook, you saw how concerned the public was. You saw how concerned parents, even your own colleagues, were about this issue. A lawsuit you'll be familiar with called the Tennessee case, filed by 45 states, accusing Meta of unfairly snaring teenagers and children on Meta products whilst deceiving the public about the hazards. You knew all this was going on, and yet you've come away saying, I think the data's a bit ambiguous.
I think the data is ambiguous. I mean, I know, of course, people don't like dealing with ambiguity, but if you look at the research from a succession of academics, all of which I cite in the book, and it's not me saying this, I really do try and as dispassionately as possible for the reader, because this is a highly emotive topic. You're dealing with parents who are anxious about their kids. What are they doing online? You're dealing, obviously, with some horrific and tragic cases of teens who've taken their own lives and so on. So I try and just very dispassionately say, this is what the evidence in terms of claim and counterclaim seems to suggest. Where I come out is, even if the evidence is much more ambivalent than I think some of the assertions suggest, in fact, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that societally, so I cannot stress enough, I'm talking now about big numbers, not about individual cases. You're always going to find individual cases where people are exposed to content they shouldn't be. But societally, the evidence is, if you look at the work, for instance, of Professor Andrew Przylski in Oxford, the Oxford Internet Institute, who's done one of the biggest longitudinal study of the relationship between the use of social media and mental well-being amongst teens and so on. It just doesn't show some great causal link, much as people would want to. Having said all of that, where I come out is, it almost kind of doesn't matter what you think the data shows. You should take a precautionary approach. That's what I did at Facebook. I pushed for and successfully pushed for and introduced a whole raft of measures which didn't exist when I arrived at the company, including now defaulting teens around the world in their hundreds of millions into much more protective, what are called teen accounts. They can't be contacted by adults.
What's interesting, I just want to drill down into this, Nick, because we've seen, I think there's some 1,400 pages of company documents and correspondence filed by the state of Tennessee in this case, including some of your emails. And what is fascinating about this is it starts a long time ago. It starts in April 2017 with Kevin Systrom, Instagram chief executive, asking for more staff to work on mitigating harms to users. And Zuckerberg then says, we've got more extreme issues, whatever. And Systrom emails again saying, we need more staff. Then it happens in January 2018. Zuckerberg receives a report about 4 million kids under 13 on Instagram against the company's own policy. Then we hear from Margaret Stewart. She says, I hope we could maintain a moderately protective stance given the risk to minors. I hope we won't look back on it years from now and feel good about the decision we made here. Frances Haugen, you know her. She disclosed thousands of pages about the internal documents about the harm done to kids. And then you get on this, I think in late 2021, and you write an email to Mark Zuckerberg saying there are mounting concerns from regulators about the company's impact on teenage mental health. You requested funding for, 45 more employees.
Yeah, sorry, you're picking so many things from before I was at the company.
It doesn't matter.
It's a huge. No, but it does actually matter.
It shows the movement from your colleagues, from Facebook executives saying this is something we keep getting wrong. It
does actually matter, I think, if taking selective quotes. I'll tell you why. Because the only measure that matters is did the company.
They're not selective quotes. What I'm showing you is.
Emily,
over the course of 5 years.
If I could just finish, I was there for 7 years, so let me just tell you my experience. So what actually matters is, did the company take measures, certainly during the time I was there, which consistently improved the safeguards which were applied to young people? The record unambiguously shows that is the case. It is a completely different company. It's a completely different set of apps. There are a whole range of new safeguards which didn't exist when I arrived in the autumn of 2018. And I'm very proud of the fact that I was one of the main proponents to make sure
Did you get those 45 extra people working? Because
I had thousands of people working for me, Emily. Honestly, with respect, what matters is the experience not of whether you pick one email from 10 years ago or not, is does a young person today using Instagram in particular...
It's not 10 years ago, Nick.
This is 2017, you said.
No, it's from 2021. You sent this email and you didn't get a response, and then you went back to Zuckerberg. You warned of the mounting concerns.
Emily.
You said we need to do more. We're being held back by a lack of investment on the product side required to be responsive to policymaker concerns. And then he starts, I think, posting about surfing, a surf picture, and you accuse him of being tone deaf. He's being accused of exploiting children, in a sense, right? He's being accused of ignoring child harm, and you accuse him of being tone deaf.
So, just to explain for your viewers and your listeners, I did not accuse him. I think what you're citing is an internal email to people who worked for me in the press department, where I said, because I think on the same day there was a congressional hearing about child safety. My concern, as part of my responsibility in the company, as one of the most senior executives there, was the reputational sort of health of the company. I felt that post might look tone deaf. So I didn't accuse him. I made a totally, candidly, commonplace observation. Nor did these emails... I mean, I spoke to Mark Zuckerberg every day, sometimes multiple times. Did we make the changes? Yes. While I was there, we made like 30, 40, 50 changes. You now have a whole experience on Instagram, which didn't even exist when I was at the company, called teen accounts. That means that if you now have a teen or 16 or below, they are automatically defaulted into something where they cannot communicate with people they could before. They have the most restrictive controls and limits on the content they can receive. They have the most restrictive kind of limits on the communication between adults and children. None of that existed when I arrived. Should it have happened earlier? Maybe. Should it have happened before I even arrived?
We
Maybe.
still have, earlier this year, the picture of British parents going to America, trying to get the company to listen to them because they have lost children and they think it's fallen on deaf ears. This happened in April of this year.
Yeah.
We know that Instagram tried to start up something called Instagram Kids. We know that they were still marketing, whether they approved it in a policy or not, to under 13-year-olds.
Do you understand what that means? I'm not sure if you do. Instagram Kids, the idea at the time, because I was very much involved in the debates, and in fact I was the person who in the company said, for a whole bunch of unrelated reasons, that I thought the company shouldn't proceed with it, and I won that argument. But just, it's really quite important, because I think you're being somewhat misleading. Messenger Kids, for those who use Messenger, is a messaging app. Messenger Kids has existed for a long period of time. It means that you can safely have a youngster use a messaging app because it has all sorts of controls, and crucially it allows parents to see exactly what their child is doing. So what the Instagram team thought, not unreasonably, is we should give parents far more control, far more visibility, so they see in real time they can control who their child is communicating with, what kind of content they're receiving. They can put time limits on what their child would use. That's actually what Instagram Kids was about. It wasn't trying to sort of...
Why did you need to market anything to kids?
It's not... But listen, you're now accusing the company of... doing something which I believe you want it to do, which is to actually make sure that when children use social media apps, which unfortunately...
Under 13, why are they using social media at all?
Well, guess what? One of the reasons is because this government, and as far as I can make out, very few governments around the world, have actually legislated to make age verification tools work properly. It's something that I have said to a succession of ministers in the United Kingdom for the last almost near decade. If you really want to make sure that you have watertight legislation to make sure that these age controls of 13 and below, or 15 below, or 16 below work, you should go much further than the Online Safety Act currently does, and make sure that every time anyone downloads an app from either the iOS App Store or the Android App Store...
But don't have them for under 13-year-olds then. I mean, you don't... If you've got age verification, then it would be working properly.
You don't have universal age verification. That is my point. The average American teen today... I mean, if I sound frustrated, it's kind of like... I wish it was as easy just to say, oh, people shouldn't do this or shouldn't do that. Do you know the average American teen now uses 40 different apps? Anyone listening to this or watching this who has teens knows they don't use one app. They use TikTok, they use Instagram.
Sorry, that's irrelevant. So don't invent a new product specifically to target kids who you don't want on social media at all.
No, Emily, you're fundamentally misunderstanding this. If teens are using multiple apps, if what you do, which is currently the case in this country, is expect each individual app to do individual age verification, you get the mess that we currently have. Parents don't understand it. Kids don't understand it. People play it. You have different and uneven standards between one app and the other. What I'm actually advocating for is to go far further than what I think you are suggesting, far further than what this government has done, far further than the legislation that has been put onto the statute book by MPs in Westminster. I'm suggesting that you should have a universal requirement on the two choke points in the internet, which are the Android and iOS app stores. You can't download apps other than those through those two app stores. And at that point, that's the choke point of the internet. That's the Google and Apple run the underlying architecture of the internet that we all use. That is the point at which you can enforce very, very stringent age verification. I made that case to this government, indeed to the previous Conservative government. It's something that can be technically done. Actually, some states, interestingly, in the United States are now starting to legislate to do just that. That is a good example of something where I don't think the industry is going to do it on its own, and it can't do it on its own. So you have to do it from the kid's point of view, and from a kid's point of view, what matters is every single kind of app they're going to use. And that's what we don't currently have. We don't have something which is universally applied to all apps.
So this is a really interesting live debate. And I do not understand why none of that has been examined in here. How did you arrive at the conclusion that all was fine?
I didn't.
At Facebook?
I didn't.
How did you arrive at the
I
conclusion?
didn't. I don't say that in the book.
Well,
no one's going to read that book and think that what you've just said is that is simply not what I say in the book.
Well, you know from everything that I've just read out, from all the executives' emails and your own emails to Mark Zuckerberg, that he was pretty much
Emily,
tone deaf.
I don't
to
actually
this
say
stuff.
that in the book. Please don't tell your viewers something which I didn't say. I actually say in the book that I think we should go much further.
You are very ambiguous, slightly defensive, but very ambiguous about whether there is any actual harm to mental health or to teens with the products that Facebook says.
No, I do two things. One, don't accept the caricature that nothing was done by those companies, because that's simply not true. And I explain in detail what was done and why those apps and services are now wholly different than they were, certainly when I first arrived in Silicon Valley 7 or 8 years ago.
So you think the problem's done?
I didn't say that either. And then I say we should go much further. So please don't foist upon me an assertion which I don't say in the book, which I would never say in the book, when in fact I've not only now, but throughout my whole time at Meta and in all my interactions with governments around the world, including a succession of British governments, I said, I think you should go much further.
Did you think Mark Zuckerberg cared about this stuff?
Yes, of course he did.
Do you, really?
Yes, of course he did. Do you look, you can think what you like about people in Silicon Valley, but this idea...
No, it's not about me. I'm asking you, because
No.
you praise him. You're pretty fulsome. You call him, I think, indefatigably competitive.
Yes, he's indefatigably competitive, sure. But look, the point is, I think the depiction that people in Silicon Valley want to actively harm children and that they have an incentive...
Okay, let me just give you this, because I think this is important. We spoke to a whistleblower, you'll know her, Sarah Wynne Williams, who described Mark like this. To Mark, the world was like a board game. Risk. Territories to be conquered, be it China or be it children. Her book was called Careless People. It's not about active harm, it's about carelessness. Do you recognise that description of Mark Zuckerberg?
I haven't read the book. I don't know Sarah Wynne Williams. She left the company before I even arrived. So
you could have read the book.
Well, I haven't read the book because I didn't. She wasn't even at the company when I was there. She left before I arrived. It's about events that I was not part of. So I don't know why.
Well, for example, she recalls a tool that Instagram was using to market beauty products to young girls who deleted photos of themselves after posting, leaning into their vulnerability. We don't see that, Mark, emerge at all here.
I can't comment about a book I haven't read, Emily, from a person I don't know.
I'm just surprised you haven't read it, because she was literally in the job before you. She was describing
things. She wasn't my job, and she left before I came. And if she'd been there, she would have worked for me, and I would have known her. So I can't.
Let me help you out then, because she's also said that Facebook worked alongside the Chinese government, helping to create a bespoke censorship tool for the Chinese government, cutting off a dissident at China's request. Did that strike you as
I wasn't
weird?
there at the time, Emily. When I arrived at the company, I was one of the first people
I'm describing the character of the company that you worked for.
Yes.
I'm describing things that happened.
I know you're describing things that I was not part of and I didn't participate in. I'm giving you an answer, which is I can only derive my conclusions about that company from my experience there.
But would that have horrified you to know that?
Well, of course it would, but I wasn't there at the time. And when I was there, I was actually the leading advocate that we shouldn't, as a company, Meta that is, try and enter into the Chinese market, because unsurprisingly, Chinese communists in Beijing don't want to have Western-style social media available to their citizens, which they still don't to this day.
But all this had happened before. You know that, for example, that Facebook was embedded in the Trump campaign of 2016. You know that executives had to explain to Mark Zuckerberg that was the power of Facebook, that you could make people change their brand of toothpaste, you could make people change their vote. And yet you go on to write in the book...
Do you believe that's true?
What?
Do you believe that what someone sees as they're scrolling on Facebook will instantly change their political opinion?
It's a really good question, because
but that's what you just asserted.
Well, you say it's deeply patronising, right?
No. I don't say that's particularly patronising. I just think there's no evidence that scrolling on a social media app changes who you vote for. And in fact, one of the things I did at the company, because there are so many claims and counterclaims about this, I set up the world's hitherto only, wholly independent research project during the time of the 2020 US election. I think there were 11 US universities involved with very, very large what are called sort of holdout groups. So you'd have sort of 250,000, 300,000, I'm sure I haven't got the numbers exactly right, but very large numbers of US voters who would use Facebook in different ways. So they would have one where there was no algorithm at all, and you just had it chronologically listed. Another one where you couldn't.
I want to get back to where we were, not just the study, Nick.
Because it's so interesting. You keep making these assertions in passing, where the evidence doesn't actually suggest the assertion you made that just using a social media app changes your political
opinion. So you
opinion.
don't think having a Facebook employee showing the Trump campaign how to use tools better swayed the vote for Trump at all?
My understanding, again, this is almost 3 years before I arrived at the company. My understanding is that all social media companies at the time, in fact, the leading proponent of using social media in American politics was Barack Obama.
Right.
So what those companies did at the time, you can retrospectively say whether it was foolish or not, is they said, let's make sure that all these politicians who want to use social media to communicate with voters know how it works. That is my understanding of what happened, that all the campaigns were, people were made available to those
But just go back to that question. Do you not think having somebody in the Trump campaign swayed the vote towards
in the Trump
They
campaign?
did. Well, according to Sarah Wynne Williams.
Look, you're asking me a question about a book I haven't read about.
But I'm trying to explain to you, because she makes some pretty important claims here about what the company was like that you went on to work for. You've been at the heart of that. Yes. This is the one chance we get to hear about the heart of Meta.
And instead of you simply asking me questions about events that didn't take place when I was there, maybe I could talk to you, including about everything that I cover in the book, about what I did see. Now, you can disagree or agree with my caricature. What you can't do is ask me to make judgment about events that I wasn't part of at all.
It's part of a bigger question. You say, page 37, it is deeply patronising to assume it can sway the way people vote. People have agency. So I'm genuinely interested to know whether you think that there is a relationship between political volatility and Facebook, or between disinformation and Facebook, whether you think that the anti-vax movement that Robert Kennedy is now espousing is dangerous on Facebook, or whether you think, well, don't be patronising, people have agency. Either you believe that this stuff can be harmful, or else you say, oh, don't be patronising, people have agency.
So, of course, content on social media can be harmful, which is why you need rules.
Well, in that case, if it can be harmful, then it can sway you, clearly.
I think there are definitely instances where people, partly because of what they consume on social media, but partly because of the circumstances of their own lives, where of course it can play a role in how they live their lives, what they do, whether they do things which are good for them. Of course it does. It'd be foolish to think otherwise, in the same way that I'm sure you, as a veteran of the British media, would not claim the British media has no influence at all.
Of course I wouldn't.
Exactly.
And I wouldn't say it's patronising if people were swayed.
What I actually said, which is quite different again to what you just suggested, I think it is patronising to assume that what people consume on social media in a sort of passive way entirely determines what they think, how they vote, how they speak, and so on. I think there's very little evidence to suggest that is the case, because guess what? Thankfully, we're much, much more complicated creatures than that. It's how we think, how we feel, how we vote depends on a whole range of issues.
But you must have thought, genuinely, Nick, you must have thought in your head, you joined Facebook in 2017, right? 18. You must have thought about whether that company had played a role in getting Trump elected. Did that never cross your mind? Did you never think...
I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that Trump would not have been president of the United States.
That's not the same thing. Did Facebook play a role in that?
Sorry, it's like saying, do I think the Daily Telegraph plays a role in British politics, or your podcast plays? Everyone plays a role because it's all part of how we consume and share information.
I'm just interested because, again, Sarah's book...
So I do, by the way, I do think it is patronising to assume that I'm not sure if this is what you're suggesting, that one social media app can somehow...
One giant influential app.
Okay, but there are many others. There are many other big apps.
I'm going to quote again from Sarah for 1 second, because she talks about a meeting that Mark Zuckerberg had in, I think it was December. He went to APAC. He met with Barack Obama, and Barack Obama basically pulled him aside, according to her conversation with him, and said, you've got to watch what you're doing. This is really dangerous, and you are going to start putting dictators in power if you don't watch what the company's doing. So Barack Obama was telling Mark Zuckerberg about the power of Facebook, and yet here you are kind of 5 years later saying it's patronising to assume that it had a big impact.
So that's not what I say in the book. You're taking one sentence from the book where I'm making a particular reference to what I think what a rather techno-determinist view that people have, which I strongly disagree with, that the idea that the technology you consume or use has an automatic effect on the way that you think and believe. I think there's no evidence that's the case. I do think that is it's techno-determinist. I do think it's patronising. I'm not extending that to a conversation which I didn't know about. I wasn't there at the time between I've spoken to Barack Obama separately about social media. I've been in conversations with him and Mark Zuckerberg many, many years later. We can talk about that if you like. You're once again asking me about a conversation of which I was not a part, from a book which I haven't read, from an employee who wasn't even at the company when I arrived. I can only speak to you from my own experiences. No one can read my book and reasonably suggest that the book says what you are now suggesting it says. I'm not giving social media a clean bill of health at all. I wouldn't have pushed as I did. I changed the whole company's stance on regulation from being implacably against regulation to actually embracing it. I think there are a whole range of things that governments need to do, which you can't just trust the tech industry to do itself. I introduced, and others did as well, it was a collective effort, a vast range of measures to protect kids. Is that work complete? No, of course it's not complete. Can you expect the industry to come up with all of the solutions? No. Does some of the solutions need to be imposed by parliaments and governments? Yes. Do I think parliaments and governments should go even further than they already have? Yes, I do. So I'm slightly dismayed that you seek to foist upon my book an interpretation of social media based on a time when I wasn't even living in Silicon Valley or even working in that company. And I would like, if it's possible, to go back to actually the themes which are in the book, derived from my own personal experience.
It's about your judgment.
About which I can speak. Yes,
it's about your judgment of your time there. And I want to go to something that was your direct action, which was removing Trump from Facebook. You recognise his posts included incitement to violence. You removed him from Facebook. Does that feel like the right move? 3 years on. I think it's anyone. I'm sure some people say, you should have done it earlier, or it's an easy decision to make. I don't think it's an easy decision to make at all for a private sector company to suspend, in that case, the outgoing president of the most powerful democracy in the world. I clearly don't agree with his politics, and I abhorred many of the things that he said then and has said on different occasions. But it definitely troubled me then and troubles me now, because it's back to your earlier point about power. It's the use of private sector power intervening in the political and public realm. And as a sort of old-fashioned liberal, I think you need to do that warily. But you did it because you recognised that it could incite violence. In other words, you saw that link between political volatility
companies
and social
like Meta,
media.
I'm not sure if you're aware of this, remove millions and millions and millions of pieces of content.
But they don't often do it to a man who's been president.
No, but you seem to be kind of almost insinuating that it's just some sort of weird, wild free-for-all. No, it isn't. There are these rules. If you want, we can go into a little bit of detail.
I'm just asking whether you
it's quite important. It's quite important, this.
There is a connection between social media and political volatility. That's all I'm saying. Right? You can see that.
Let me try and explain to you. Let me try and explain. There are things called community standards, which are, I think there are 20 to 21 categories of content, which Meta as a company, and I guess the other companies do something similar. And one of my responsibilities in the 7 years I was at Meta was to oversee the development of these rules. They're rules, and they say there are certain categories of intellectual property fraud you can't commit on Facebook. You can't bullying and harassment, certain categories of hate speech. And incitement to violence is clearly a category of content, which of course these companies don't want on their site. And can I explain to you why they don't, which is why it's so different to the caricature I think you seem to be perpetuating here? Because they're run. Remember who pays their bills? It's advertisers. If you're an advertiser selling a car or kitchenware or washing up liquid, you don't want your content near vile, hateful, insightful content. So the company has it's not even altruism, has a vast standing commercial incentive to make sure that its content rules, these community standards, are abided by. One of my responsibilities in overseeing a whole bunch of teams in that company in this instance, did what Donald Trump said. I think he initially said it on Twitter and then just reposted it automatically on Facebook a couple of hours later. Did that break those community standards? That was the judgment I had to make. And my judgment at that time was that it broke the community standards, and it was very important for Facebook in the end, however much it was a high wire act, suspending a very prominent and powerful if outgoing president at the time, I thought it was very important to demonstrate that it didn't matter who you were, you could be the Pope or a pauper. If you broke the company's community standards, you would attract the same penalty as anybody else. So that was my thinking. That was the decision I took. I, of course, stand by it now. Your question was a somewhat different one, is do I think it's a difficult decision? Of course I think it's a difficult decision.
No, it wasn't that. It was whether you recognised that if he had incited violence in the post, I think that was part of why he'd broken the community standards according to your 21 rules, wasn't it? Incitement to violence.
Yeah.
Then presumably...
But do you know, all of what he'd said, this is so interesting, was on every television in the country, was on every radio station, was on every newspaper. It's this sort of extraordinary sort of insinuation that somehow what he said on Facebook was uniquely corrosive, but what he said on every single network, every single cable news television channel or programs that you've been on somehow don't have the same effect.
No, I'm not.
And guess what? Actually, a lot of the limits that Meta imposes on speech are much stricter than many of certainly than cable news in America. Many of the advertising restrictions, for instance, on political advertising, are far stricter.
Yeah, you removed him. So I mean, don't get mad at me. You removed him. So this is according to your rules.
No, but you're then trying to extrapolate that and say, therefore...
No, I'm asking, do you recognise that there is a link, a strong link, between political volatility, instability and social media? Do you recognise that?
I think history shows that political volatility, I'm afraid, was not invented when social media was invented. Do you think Stalin or Pol Pot or the polarisation extremism of the 1930s or world wars or civil wars going back decades and centuries, none of them erupted mass violence, prejudice?
So you don't think that social media then plays a particular role in this? That's all I'm trying to understand.
Again, the research, if you look at the research, what the academics call, and I describe this in the book and I describe it as dispassionately as I can, called affective polarisation. The research suggests so affective polarisation, as academics measure it, actually increased most rapidly in the years, I think the 80s, before, in the United States, in large parts of the West, before social media was invented. And more than that a lot of polarisation seems to have increased most rapidly amongst people who use social media the least, often people who haven't got college or university degrees, who are elderly. So the evidence, since I'm interested in evidence, it is not as cut and dry. Does that mean that companies like that should be indifferent to what is said on their platform? Absolutely not. Did I make sure while I was there, not least perhaps notoriously in the case of suspending Trump, that if the community standards were broken, sanctions and penalties were applied? Yes, I did. But this is...
Do you think it cost you your job?
What, that I suspended Trump?
Yeah.
No, I left. I didn't...
Are you sure?
Am I sure I left?
I mean, are you sure you didn't get fired?
That's a really weird question. Who else is going to know whether I got fired or not? Me. I left. I chose to leave. I chose to leave at a time of my own choosing. Not
because the company decided that you'd be no use to them when Trump was re-elected.
It's a whole bunch. Do you want to go into the reasons why I decided? I mean, why I decided to leave?
I'm just asking you. A lot of people are saying, well, did he really leave or was he pushed? That's the question I'm putting to you.
Okay. And I'm giving you the answer. I left. I chose to leave.
And if Kamala Harris had been elected, do you think you would have stayed?
Might have done. I certainly felt that I wasn't particularly interested in, it didn't really appeal to me or my sort of skill set when I saw that the sort of, it wasn't just Meta, that Silicon Valley as a whole was going to enter into a wholly different relationship with the powers that be with the US. Can I finish the sentence? I thought at that point, I had actually spent most of my time at that company advocating a sort of distance really between Silicon Valley and politicians, and I felt that, as they clearly are now, working sort of hand in glove with each other. I mean, you now have the chief technology officers, a lot of these big platforms, not just Meta, who actually, I think they've been adopted into military regiments that are in the US, which are being used to deploy the AI inventions of Silicon Valley for, the defence and national security purposes of the United States. They're free to do so. Is that something which sort of interests me? Was that in line with my view about the kind of division of labour between politics and... No, of course it wasn't.
Okay, that's a generous assessment. I mean, I guess one way of looking at it is...
There's a running theme here. Everything I say, you sort of feel is not... You want me to sort of almost say what you want me to say, which is that I'm more sort of critical or this.
No,
I'm trying to give it to you as dispassionately as possible.
No, I'm trying to give our viewers, our audience and our listeners a sense of what your takeaway is of Facebook, of Meta now. And frankly, We all saw that picture of Trump's inauguration
Yeah.
with Mark Zuckerberg
Yeah.
and others standing right behind him. We read about him ditching the external fact check. I just wonder, Nick, whether you didn't, after 7 years, think, why have I wasted my time here? Was it all for nothing? I mean,
Because they went to the
right
inauguration.
back in Trump's pocket.
Because they went to the inauguration.
Right back in Trump's pocket.
Sorry, you think that everything I did for 7 years was for naught because they went to the inauguration?
I'm asking you if you feel that way. Do you feel that way?
Well, self-evidently, I don't. It was an odd question that because all of the Silicon Valley leaders collectively went to the inauguration. Would I have gone? No. Do I therefore think everything that I did for 7 years was? What an odd.
Well, you're
assertion.
sounding quite defensive, but I think it's
I'm
fairly.
not,
I think it's a fairly natural question
I'm not
to
defensive.
ask.
I'm being quite open with you. I'm very exasperated that you portray my book as saying something which it doesn't say, which I think is honestly not very.
You're quite phlegmatic about the rights and wrongs and the damages and the.
I'll tell you why.
And the influence of social media.
What you call,
I'm surprised.
Yeah, because you have a fixed view. And I hate to break this to you.
I don't have a fixed view. I've read your book and I'm asking you about it.
No, but maybe your fixed
That's
view
what
is
we're
not
doing.
correct. And what I'm trying to do in the book, amongst other things, is absolutely to break down what I think is a tendency for people to just sort of throw rocks at this problem, this issue, and make what I think are simplistic and sweeping assertions about the role of social media in society, about the role of social media in politics. And what I try and do, you call it phlegmatically, I try and do it as objectively and rigorously as possible in the book. I would urge anyone to read the book and then decide for themselves. I try and lay out what the evidence is. I don't, for instance, think there is evidence to your earlier assertion that social media is somehow wholly, largely or exclusively responsible for political division and polarisation, given that political polarisation and division, unfortunately, has been around since the dawn of time and erupts and re-erupts at a whole bunch of different moments in our collective history. So you're right, I don't indulge in, because I don't believe in indulging in caricatures about complicated subjects. Okay. And I've always believed, whether it's in politics or as in Silicon Valley, that instead of just sort of dismissing complexity, it is sometimes necessary and more honest to actually engage with it. That's what I try and do in the book. That's why, of course, I find it a little bit exasperating. We spent, 40 minutes with you basically asking me questions based on a set of
about
assertions.
Teen safety, yeah.
No.
Well, about the stuff
and
that
I've explained
people are
on teen
genuinely
safety.
interested
I think we should go a lot further.
Yeah.
We go a lot further than we currently have done. And I, if you want to know, I'm exasperated on that point because I said to a succession of ministers in the British government, this government and previous ones, you're not legislating far enough to make age verification watertight. Okay. I actually think there are areas where we should go a lot further.
Let's talk a bit about the way the book ends, and you get on to AI. We've talked a bit about the case for the internet staying open. You explain that it is. I mean, it's already becoming harder with the sort of triangulations we're seeing between Modi and Xi, and Trump doesn't seem to be an open government kind of guy, particularly. What about AI? Do you think that governments around the world get how radical this shift is going to be to the workplace, to all of us, to jobs?
I think the honest answer is no one really knows, is the honest answer. I think you've got a lot of claim and counterclaim again about what generative AI is and what it's going to bring. You have a real tendency in Silicon Valley, it's a hype-filled place. People are constantly leaping from one hype cycle to the next. And you've got to remember, a lot of these people who are making these predictions about it's going to put everybody out of work by next Tuesday and so on. You know, they've got technology to sell. They've got to raise money for the latest foundation models, which are very, very expensive to build. So you've got another cycle, and we also have a tendency, which is a curious one, which is we call it artificial intelligence, but we spend all our time anthropomorphizing it. We sort of keep imbuing it with human qualities. They're machines. They're probabilistic machines. They digest vast amounts of data. There's a whole debate about exactly what kind of data they can ingest, but just vast amounts of data from the public internet and so on. And then they make these connections, these what are called parameters, billions of them across all of that data set, and they spit out these probabilistic. I was using ChatGPT this morning. It's amazing. You ask these questions, it sort of talks to you in a sort of human voice, but it doesn't sort of know the world. It has no conscience. It has no. So I feel we're trapped in an environment where clearly this technology is very, very powerful, very versatile. It seems to me obviously will have some very profound effects on how we shop, how we book our holidays.
But how we work. I mean, you've got young adults, children kind of entering the work.
But again, it's not the first time that technology has had a very disruptive effect over time on the labour market. We used to live in a country where 85% of people were in the, made their living in agriculture, agricultural mechanisation.
Do you think this is bigger than the Industrial Revolution?
I personally think some of the hype about saying it's bigger than fire or the wheel or the printing press is excessively breathless. I think it is. Remember, artificial intelligence has been around or talked about since the 1950s. It's an evolution in it. I think there are some jobs which clearly will get obviously disrupted by AI, because you'll have AI agents and bots doing things that human beings might do. I think the question I have, and I just really don't know what the answer is not will it have a sort of an effect on the labour market? Clearly it will. I think the more important question is how quickly will it?
Yeah.
What's the pace? Because I think history suggests that, again, looking at the evidence, that it's the pace of technological disruption of the labour market which is the most painful thing. If it's very sudden, it obviously creates an enormous amount of societal pain. If you have time to adapt to it, then I think we as society, we've done this before, whether it's through, mechanisation, agricultural industrialisation, and so on. And on that, I just don't know. I think there are some areas of work where I think the impact is going to be quite quick. There are other areas of the labour market where I actually think the adoption might be much, much more slow than that, not least because this technology is quite flawed. Remember, don't rely on this technology if you want absolute accuracy in law or accountancy. You can try and fine tune your own model.
I always tell ChatGPT when it's wrong. It's really funny.
Yeah.
I always tell it when it's wrong, and it apologises straight away.
Yeah. No, exactly, and it'll do it in that slightly sort of unctuous tone, which they've all adopted now. So I think it is a very powerful technology. It's a very versatile technology. I think there are clearly transformation in things like medical and health diagnostics and others which are going to be fantastic. For me, on the labour market question, since that's what you asked about jobs, I think it just all depends on how quickly this is really adopted in workplaces of it. And quite a the early evidence suggests that, I think there was an MIT study out a couple of weeks ago which suggested that actually where executives have tried to introduce it in their companies, I think in America, the benefits have been pretty meagre. So I think everyone's still trying to work. And remember, lots of people have an incentive not to deploy it in their workplace because they're worried about their own job. So I think there'll be some resistance. So I think pace is the thing I would really look out for. And that's a difficult one because I certainly think as far as Britain is concerned, since we're not going to compete with the American and Chinese companies on building these models in the first place, the area where we might extract the greatest benefit is actually deploying it more successfully in schools and hospitals and workplaces than in other. So there's a sort of ambivalence about the pace.
I want to come back to British politics for a moment. You've been at the heart of government. You will have seen the Keir Starmer sort of mini reset or relaunch yesterday. I'm sure you wouldn't give him advice, but what would you be doing differently, thinking differently? How would you approach?
The impression I get is they're still trapped in a set of judgments or misjudgments they made before they even got into power, which is often the case in politics. Boy, do I know it. But the way I see it, because all of this comes really down to the government and the economy and their commitments to producing growth and why they're failing to do so. And I think...
So not small boats, not immigration.
I think immigration is super important, absolutely, but they need to get on top of that. I suspect they will over a period of time. I think in the long run, by the next election, this is my guess, as I think one way or another they'll get on top of this small boats issue. I think they have to show they have control. That's, if I was in government, I'd be remorseless on that. I think they, one way or another, they will. I think, however, it's what people feel about their jobs, about money in their pockets, about, are their wages rising in real terms and so on. And I think that's, for me, the more fundamental problem for this government, which is that the Labour Party, and I remember this when I was in coalition, basically spent a decade lying to itself and its supporters about some of the basic facts of how you run an open economy with a floating exchange rate like ours. They vilified any attempt to try and bring any fiscal discipline or any fiscal kind of constraints to what money comes into the government, what money goes out. They fetishised this word austerity and so on, even though during the coalition years, I can only speak for the coalition years, not what George Osborne and others did afterwards, but during the coalition years, we actually reduced the deficit more slowly than Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling had planned themselves and legislated for. So they became so opposed to any kind of the sort of basic laws of economic and fiscal gravity. Then late on, before the election, they thought, we must try and do something to keep the markets off our back. So they made this totally rash claim of saying we're not going to touch any of the big taxes, income tax, VAT, and employee national insurance.
Well, they didn't say employee. They said national insurance.
They said national. Okay. Well, you'll know better than I do. But anyway, which are the big levers? And then, of course, they had this endless narrative saying there's not been any growth for 14 years. Not true. So, literally false. The latter years of the coalition. I'm very proud of this. We actually helped, certainly the government at the time, take a economy which was deeply damaged by the 2008 financial crisis, and by the middle years of the coalition onwards, it was the fastest growing economy in the G7. So I think if you go into government tying your hands unnecessarily on tax, basically fibbing about the economic record over the last decade and a half, and being so sort of moralistic and sanctimonious about any attempt to try and introduce fiscal discipline to an economy, you end up with the result which we have now. Today we have found that long-term borrowing rates in this country are now the highest they have been since that financial crash. That is very serious. It means that we're spending about 10% of our of government revenue just on servicing our debts, and the cost of those long-term yields are going up and up and up. We've now got the highest long-term debt servicing costs of any G7 economy. So they're in real trouble. They have got no margin of manoeuvre because of those errors. And I don't honestly have, I have a lot of sympathy for Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves personally. I think they're good, decent people, but I have no sympathy for them politically, because it's a series of misjudgments they've made over the last decade. And I think what they should have done, this is my view, and I felt it at the time, was when Trump was elected, they came out and they said the world has changed utterly. They were right. And at that point, I think they could have carried the country with them if they'd said the world has changed utterly and we are going to change with it. We're now going to face basically a tariff war with our erstwhile...
And done what? And borrowed?
No. I think they will need to revisit taxation, but you need to do it with a full suite of taxes, which is.
So you'd say raise taxes, would you? Going into
it's part of the mix. Yeah. If you're facing the highest long-term borrowing costs since the financial crash in 2008, you have a number of choices. Yeah. You have to generate more revenue, you have to either or reduce spending, or you have to raise some taxes, or a mixture of all of them. It'll be a mixture of all of them. It always is. But they've got into such trouble because they've taken off the table the very taxes where actually you can spread the burden most even. And of course I know, if you read the pages of The Guardian, everyone says, just soak the rich and that'll all be solved. I'm afraid I wish it was as easy as that. Sure, you can put up taxes for the rich. That's never going to pay for the huge costs that this country now faces. You have to have some broad-based tax measures included in the mix.
You were in government for 5 years with David Cameron and George Osborne. Do you speak to them still? Do you speak to David?
I haven't for a while. I think we've agreed to see each other shortly, but no, I don't.
Would you call them buddies?
No.
Did they screw you? I mean, do you think at the end of it, all's fair in love and elections?
No, I think in politics you shouldn't whinge about. No. I mean, by the way, when I said it's because they're not mates, because I didn't go into government to find mates. I mean, thankfully I've got a rich circle of friends of my own. But do we have perfectly civilised conversations when we meet with each other? Of course, I don't hold any animus. And on politics, you shouldn't go to politics. You live by the sword, you die by the sword. I made mistakes. I think the coalition government. I think with each passing day, in my view, of course, maybe I'm not wholly objective, but I think any reasonable assessment would suggest that government for that 5-year period, particularly given what we inherited in the shadow of the terrible financial crisis in 2008, was the best government that this country's had over the last decade and a half. And I think the record shows that it was a reforming government. We had the fastest growing G7 economy. We had low unemployment. Things we didn't fix were things like productivity, and real wage increases were slow to come through, and then unfortunately finally started coming through, and then everything was undone by that madness of Brexit, which I still think is one of the greatest acts of self-harm really in the last century for our country.
I was thinking back, Nick, I think you did one of the only political mea culpas I can remember of the last 10 years.
Put to music.
I wonder what you think of the political apology now. Everyone seems very good at apologising for other people's misdeeds or missteps.
My political apology?
Do you look back and you think, I went out there, I apologised, I then lost my seat, the party tanked, why did I bother?
Oh, because I don't think it's as simple as that. I don't think it's one event or one apology that makes the political weather. I mean, I think look, smaller political parties in coalitions, unfortunately, seems to be a bit of a rule of thumb across Europe. We're not really a country that has coalitions very often. It was the first and hitherto last coalition in this country in the post-war period. But if you look in Holland, if you look in Germany, I'm afraid it's a pattern over and over again, particularly where centre-left parties go into coalition with centre-right parties and so on. You tend to get hammered. We didn't have any, I mean, I'm not whining about this, but we didn't really have any major vested interest in the press who were prepared to look out for us. So look, do I think if I hadn't made that apology, the outcome of the 2000, of course not. I don't think it would have made the blindest bit of difference.
Why do you think people don't apologise anymore, though?
It was this whole sort of PR orthodoxy that it shows weakness and this. Look, everyone has to take their own decision. I think the Lib Dems and I think I were in a totally invidious position on this issue because fees had been introduced by the Labour Party, not by us. Had actually been increased against their own manifesto commitment previously by the Labour Party. We then inherited a report from man called Mr. Brown, which had been commissioned by Peter Mandelson by the Labour Party to have no upper limit on fees at all. And we inherited this thing, try to come up with the best possible policy. It wasn't consistent with our own manifesto. But guess what? I hadn't won the election. I didn't have a majority.
I mean,
so I think we're in this position, but people were,
I guess the thing that, you've had people saying for the last 10 years is you could have abstained. You could have just said, you know where my policy is. I know where the Tories are. I'm just going to abstain.
We still would have got the blame because I was the Deputy Prime Minister. We were in government. I mean, people don't look at the exact voting record to decide how they. Most normal human beings, thankfully, don't look at politics as closely as you do, or I used to, and they wouldn't. They would have just looked at a government.
Yeah. To be honest, my question was only about the political apology. I was just interested to see whether you think, is the mea culpa dead?
Well, it certainly is in the age of Trump, isn't it? Where you literally just do very unscrupulous things, and you appear to sort of. It's just not my style. It's not the way I would have been able to operate. I could see sort of how much kind of controversy and anguish and anger that decision had made. I tried to explain it over and over and over again. Of course, in politics, what do they say? If you're explaining, you're losing. So I felt I should try and sort of be open about the fact that, of course, I regretted that things turned out like that. But if it wasn't that, I probably would have found something else to, regret. Guess what? We're all flawed. All governments are not perfect. No government's record is unblemished. I'm incredibly proud of the coalition. I genuinely think it's the best government this country has had in a very long period of time. But yeah, I like to think that most voters would kind of just accept that if you feel you've messed up, you kind of say so. But who knows? Maybe that is now out of fashion. If it is, so be it.
Nick Clegg, thanks very much.
Thank you.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.